Okay, we've got 11:02 Mountain Standard Time. Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for attending. This is Data Source Consulting and EXL Company. This is our educational webinar series. And today's presentation is how reference data underpins your MDM success. And it's really interesting to me because looking back at this year in the spring, I attended the MDM Data Governance Summit in San Francisco, and then also attended the one in the fall in New York. And it was very interesting to me with regards to reference data, how in the spring, it was an undertone at the conference. And then in the fall, reference data had shifted from really being an undertone to really being the primary focus of MDM success. And so it's very interesting to me that in just a 6-month span, how it had become something just so critical to making sure that these types of engagements are successful. So hopefully this presentation today can be of benefit to all of you. Very quickly, like to express a little bit about the companies, both Data Source Consulting as well as Orchestra Networks, and really why we've got experience in this space. So Data Source Consulting, we are an enterprise data management consulting firm. And obviously we specialize in master data management, enterprise data management, modern data architectures, and decision intelligence. We provide both strategic and implementation services, and because we've done a number of these types of engagements, we like to bring these lessons learned to the forefront and share it with the community that is also about to undertake similar types of efforts, and hopefully those lessons learned can be of value to you. Orchestra Networks is a software solutions provider. Their product is called EBX5. And in addition to mastering the data, it also helps you govern it, and it also supports reference data management. That product, EBX5, has been a tool that we've been able to leverage in a number of the successful MDM projects that we have implemented. With that, let me go ahead and introduce your speakers today. We will be joined by Mr. Solomon Williams. He is Director of EDM Solutions here at Data Source Consulting, and he comes with over 20 years of experience. And this experience spans enterprise data architecture, master data management, services-oriented architecture, data quality, and data governance. And any of you getting ready to undertake an MDM project, you know how those three, data governance, data quality, and MDM, are truly the trifecta to success, as well as integration and data warehousing experience. So that's Solomon. So very glad to have him with us today. We are also joined by Conrad Chang. He is the Director of Solutions and Strategy and Product Marketing for Orchestra. He is responsible for the EBX solution and providing experience and education in the marketplace around master data management, reference data management, as well as data governance. Both of these individuals are sought-out speakers, both within the master data management as well as the data governance communities. With that, my name is Deborah Langer, Vice President at Data Source Consulting, and I'll be your moderator today. I'll facilitate the questions at the end. Today's presentation is about 45 minutes in length, and then we'll save the remaining 15 minutes for Q&A. In your dialog box there, you'll see a tab labeled questions. If at any point you have a question that you would like answered, feel free just to type your question into that box, and at the end of the presentation, we'll go through those. Be respectful for everyone's time. We will end right on time, and if there are questions remaining, we will get those answered via email. Today's agenda is: what is reference data? Why should we even care about reference data? What is reference data management? And what does reference data management require? How do you get there? And then the Q&A session. With that, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to pass the baton over to Mr. Solomon Williams.
And hello, everybody. And again, thank you for joining us on this webinar on reference data and how it underpins MDM success. So let's get into it. What exactly is reference data? Well, reference data is a foundational subset of master data. In many cases, it's a secondary or it's an afterthought, but it is an absolute critical component. And it comes from the exact same systems where your master data comes from. As an example, if you have an ERP system, or if you have a billing system, or an invoicing system, the data that you're pulling from those systems that you're including into your master data domain, those systems have reference data that's used to keep those transactions in context. So when we're pulling that information and we're building a master data domain, we need to also bear in mind that that master data needs to be in context for the larger organization. And it is reference data that is going to help do that. Reference data is also shared and connected to multiple constituencies, domains, or systems, wherein you may have a customer domain, or a product domain, or a billing domain, or a well master domain. The reference data, which helps put that data in context and organize that data, is shared across numerous systems and domains. That data has to be related. When you're looking at any multi-domain implementation, it's not just having that collection of golden records of the customer, the product, the patient, the well master, or the retailer, the vendor, but how those domains relate to one another is where the true value of multi-domain MDM comes from. Another characteristic of reference data is that it's generally semantically stable. Now, what does that mean? There's a lot of leaves in there, right? So generally what it means is that it doesn't change very much. There may be some changes over a period of time, but the frequency by which it changes is very, very slow. And lastly, and most significantly, I would say, is that it provides that context and classification. So whether you're looking at a hierarchy definition, or you're looking at a grouping, or you're looking at an organization method, it is that reference data that provides the means to do that categorization or context and classification in this regard. Now, one particular taxonomy that we leverage, and this one is from the MDM Institute. If you're familiar with the MDM and Data Governance Conference that Deborah made reference to in the beginning of the webinar that are held in San Francisco and New York, this particular taxonomy comes from those folks that sponsor it, the MDM Institute. And what you'll see here, starting at the top, is that you'll have this multi-domain reference data, and then within it, you'll see you have the public external reference data, semi-private, and private internal. Now let's look at those. The public external reference data refers to the countries and subdivisions, currency codes, time zones, and industry classifications, whether you're looking at NAICS or ISIC, from domestic US and America or international. Those types of codes are the public codes, and there are also things like IDC codes, diagnosis codes, or billing codes that come from the health exchanges and things along that line. Now, the next level down is the semi-private. Now, this is where we'll leverage public external reference data and combine that with internal information, that shared private data that might be a billing code or a combination or a hybrid of a given, let's say, a DUNS number that's available from a customer, and that's married with a billing code or an expense code internally, so that we have a unique identifier. And that's that semi-private layer. And then when we get down to the very lowest level, the private internal reference data, as you can see, that's the chart of accounts, how we're organized, the employees or the employee IDs. That's the internal, that protected reference data that we use again. And if you look at the model, that public, semi-private, and private internal, it is classifying and it is organizing and putting that data in context. And wanted to give you this reference, so as we go through the rest of the presentation, you begin to think about that context and classification of reference data. Now, there is another larger area, the real-time transactional reference data, that the MDM Institute speaks about, and that is real-time data where we're pulling in markers from the exchanges, whether you're pulling that from NASDAQ or Bloomberg or, the other large organizations' data feeds that occur in real time. If you're looking at positions from a financial services perspective and security masters and things along that line that have to be updated in real time, that's that transactional level reference data. And one of the key indicators between the two, or the differentiators between the two, is that multi-domain reference data is, again, not real time. It is related to a given transaction or a business event that occurs in the company, but that real-time transactional reference data is coming in a real-time basis. And with this, I'm going to hand this over to Conrad.
Thanks, Solomon. So why do we care? Why do we care? Well, we care about reference data for the same reason we care about master data. So over the summer, there was this fantastic article from the Wall Street Journal called "In TV Ratings Game, Networks Try to Guise," spelled incorrectly, "Bad News," spelled incorrectly, from Nielsen. And it's actually a clear-cut case of where master data modification and also reference data modification was used to game the system, so to speak. So what did the networks do? If you look at the second paragraph, what they were doing is perturbing things like the title of the show. That's master data. So on days when they knew that NBC Nightly News was doing poorly, they would rename the show. So rather than NBC NIGH, it would be NBC NITE. And thereby, they would alter the actual sample size upon which ratings were computed. If you go to the next slide, that's master data. If you go to the next slide, you can see here that they were also manipulating show classification, or they were using reference data manipulation in the sense that instead of badging something as a repeat or as a rerun, they would badge it as an encore. So they would classify it differently. So what's the net effect of these two things? If you go to the next slide, you'll notice the net effect of modifying the actual name and also the net effect of modifying the classification or altering reference data. That actually changes the basis upon which you do things like compute average viewership, median viewership, time watched, and all those things have an impact on ad rates. So clearly, one of the things that we concern ourselves with when we think about both master and reference data is what impact does it have on things such as reporting and also measurement. So that's one pretty funny example. If you go again into the next slide, Solomon mentioned semantically stable, right? So he said reference data is generally semantically stable. So when we think about geographic classifications, the word Boston, which represents the city of Boston, a city in the state of Massachusetts, is generally thought of as a fairly semantically stable idea or concept. However, if you look at the actual reference data sets, which Boston are you really talking about? So if we click once and we look, this Boston is just the political jurisdiction of the city of Boston. So if you live within the boundaries of that little red area, then you're technically a citizen of Boston. You can vote in the elections, you go for mayor, vote for city council, go to BPD, go to Boston Public Schools, BPS. That's the Boston urban area. If you click again, this is the wider Boston metropolitan area, or MSA, or Metropolitan Statistical Area by US Census. And if you notice, it extends almost up into New Hampshire. Actually, it does extend into New Hampshire and extends down almost towards Fall River, which is another city in Massachusetts. And if we click one more time, you can see that this is the Boston CSA, or Combined Statistical Area. And that's including everything going all the way west past Worcester, another city in Massachusetts. So I think one of the things that bothers me when I read the popular press is that a lot of times when people report economic stats, they'll say things such as, Boston has grown 20% over the past year. The question is, which Boston are they talking about? One of the challenges we see a lot, and this kind of is a weird intersection between both reference data and data governance. Which Boston are you using? Are you using the Boston political markers? Are you using the Boston Metropolitan Statistical Area? Are you using Boston CSA, CBSA? What are you using to actually classify Boston? And you can see all kinds of these types of issues crop up especially when you're dealing with organizations. So for those of you that worked with any kind of sales staff, especially organizations that have geographic breakouts for their sales territories, differences in how people are classifying or defining areas of the world can have a material impact on how reporting is done, how people are assigned, how distribution is performed. So reference data is pretty important. Now, if we take a conceptual view, kind of dialing it back or pulling it back to the 30,000-foot level on the next slide, one of the reasons why reference data is an important part of a master data management program is because oftentimes master data relies upon reference data and consistent reference data so you can link together or enforce consistency across your different reference data sets. If you think about it from a computer science or graph network type approach, you could argue that master data itself could be thought of as a scale-free network. And in the lower right-hand corner, we have a representation of the U.S. flight network and the major hubs. You can see Chicago on there. You can see DFW on there. You can see LA. You can see Atlanta. Reference data appears to be, in a lot of the implementations we've seen, appears to be those hubs. And so if you imagine what happens to U.S. air travel if there's a storm over the Midwest and Chicago goes down for a couple hours, what kind of impact that has on the overall transaction throughput, you can kind of estimate or guess as to the kind of data quality issues you're going to run into if you start messing around with your reference data. So that's why it's important. Did you want to, Solomon, did you? Yeah.
No, I think that's excellent. And I'm going to move forward to the next slide. And to just take what Conrad had just described from that graphing perspective, and you look at reference data in a larger business context, what we have on this slide is basically just showing a generic supply chain wherein you have your inbound operations, outbound sales, marketing, and servicing. And you begin to think about master data and how it applies. You begin to see how your various master data domains, how they cross these verticals of the primary activities of your supply chain. Looking at your supplier hub, your materials master, product, location, and customer, as you're pulling data from these various systems, because again, these are activities that are part of a business process, there are numerous applications that support it. And in pulling that master data in across these verticals, how do you begin to put that in context? How do you begin to organize that? And then there's this one interesting one that Conrad and I discuss quite frequently around the employee master. We've seen both implementations of an employee master being part of the master data. We've also seen employee master be part of the reference data, depending on your context and how you're implementing it. Because this data crosses these various verticals, you begin to see how they align to your various support processes, your order to cash, order to opportunity, market to opportunity, idea to market, and how are all of those related? And these lines represent, coming from these various domains, represent the relationships to these processes as they cross these activity verticals. And then one of the other things to call out specifically, the hierarchy management, that significant component, not most, but a very significant component of reference data management. How does that relationship, how does that hierarchy get defined between the various domains themselves? So you begin to get the picture that, again, even though you're looking at a specific constituency for your various master data domains, as you see, they begin to align to the various critical business processes of an organization. They're related. They're very much related. So understanding how the hierarchy, the relationships, the context, the organization of these various domains and hubs to these business processes become critical. And just to pull in the comments that Conrad made into this slide, even if one of the hierarchies well defined or based upon poor data quality, it will ripple through the entire organization that is consuming that master data. Now here, what we also wanted to show is just one other aspect, and that is the governance and the metadata components and how they tie in. And these components are also, to some degree, forms of reference data, because in the governance, that glossary, if you will, as you're defining the terms, let's harken back to the Boston is not Boston example, how you're defining it, what you're using it for, is going to have a material impact on how that data is consumed and how it's used. So if you're looking at a Northeast sales organization, your organization in the Northeast, if you're looking at your distribution centers in a given region, how are you defining a region? What are the boundaries of that region? If you're looking at patient demographics or physician concentrations, by what measure, by what definition are you using that? And then from an IT metadata perspective, when you look at the lineage and the transformations and the configuration items or applications that data is coming from, that technical metadata is going to give you context that this data has been transformed, this data attribute or element has been transformed, or it is a composition, it is a formula based up of these constituent elements. Those two are reference data because it's going to give you that context of how you're going to organize this data and what this data means. So again, one of the things that we try to inculcate as we go through these processes is that master data management, reference data management, data governance, data quality, they are all very tightly related. And particular to this webinar, what we're really wanting to get across and impress upon folks is that bear in mind your master data management strategy needs to include your reference data management strategy. It is not secondary, it is not a second-class citizen, and its overall success of your MDM must be underpinned by your reference data management components. Conrad, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, so it's funny that you should say it's not a second-class citizen. It's been our experience, and I think it's going to vary, right? So if you think about the three main types of reference data that the MDM Institute talks about, private, semi-private, and public, at least what we've observed is that public reference data is usually not managed by anybody. I don't know if you've seen the same thing. So what you end up with is you end up with folks using different versions of the same reference data set. So somebody's using 2007 NAICS codes over here, whereas someone else is using SIC codes and a crosswalk table to try and figure out how to map it to their business. Or you have people using different country code sets. And it causes a lot of reporting problems, and it causes a lot of operational issues. but we've seen that. And the interesting kind of offshoot, especially for folks thinking about, well, how do I operationalize this and roll out my data management program, is that if it's kind of an important but unloved area of your business, it could be a good place to start because nobody at present owns it. And we've had several clients, I don't know if your experience is similar, but we've had several clients where that was what they started with. They started with things like trading holidays or geographies or region roll-ups because it was really important. It was having a material impact on the reporting, and nobody owned it. And it was a good opportunity to take it over. So that's one thing. I think the second thing that we also observed is that, the questions about like the Boston is not Boston, that question. So which classification or which style of classification, which hierarchy are my material management systems using versus my customer master versus my supplier hub? Where do you put that? And I think one of the things that we've observed is that if you don't have an RDM, there's no place to record that information. There's no place to memorialize that governance data. So it's just to reiterate your comment that, all of this stuff is all tied together, really.
No, absolutely. And just one other point to, again, I love the context that you bring, is that when everybody owns it, nobody owns it. And that's just one of the topics. I absolutely agree. We've seen that over and over again, Well, who owns this? Nobody does. And well, then if everybody owns it, nobody owns it. And I absolutely agree with you that one of the most significant things is that you have a stewardship. It has someone own it. And I agree that if you are pioneering an MDM initiative in your environment and you find that there's this body of reference data that is not owned, particularly public, which is a great place to start, to step there and, pick that up, own it as your first foray, and you will see value come out of that with regard to reporting. And that is a great way to start getting the organization to evangelize on the benefit. That's the only point I wanted to make there.
I completely agree.
All right. So going to the next, there's multiple kinds of master data that interlock with one another. And as we're going to show this, that master data, the whole goal of it is to be able to provide that validated, clarified, best available record, golden record, that is available for a given domain. And by domain, whether it's customers, business partners, assets, bill of materials, employees, counterparties, that's one aspect of it. That reference data, again, how we classify things, ties into providing that context. And then that metadata provides meaning. Master data, reference data, metadata. They are dependent on one another. And that being said, I want to be very clear here that it doesn't mean that if you're starting a master data management initiative, it has to be a ginormous, massive undertaking and you have to define every single attribute. No, that's not the case. What is when you lock into your scope of what is the domain that we are creating, what is the domain that we are implementing, what is the reference data that we need to support that domain, let's start one at a time, and understand the metadata that we need to bring in to bring meaning and describe that master data. So that cycle is important, but it is also important to manage your scope and to put some boundaries and guideposts around there so you're not having to think, you don't want to go off thinking that I have to define this whole thing for the entire enterprise. No, you don't. But that DNA of the enterprise you will find is locked in to that particular module right there of master data, how we manage the important data, reference data, how we classify and organize that data, and then the metadata, how is it that we describe it. Conrad, would you like to take these?
Sure. So, when we think about what is reference data management, it's the people, processes, and systems that are used to keep reference data accurate and consistent. So if we take this kind of one at a time, people, I think one of the things that there's a temptation to do is to assume that the stewards, the data governance folks, the people on your council, that's it, right? It's actually people. When we say people, we're not just talking about the folks on the core team. I think you need to think beyond that. You need to think about how is this going to be adopted by the rest of your business users. When I think back to my career as a product marketing person and having to do analysis of my product lines, having access to things such as sales hierarchies or cost center or even revenue center type reporting from the finance team was pretty important for me. And one of the things that I always had to do is to kind of go beg people in finance to give me a copy in Excel, right? I think that if you're talking about building momentum or you're building some type of groundswell of support for driving a program forward, thinking about the other consumers in the organization that are really on the consulted and informed side of a RACI matrix, RACI matrix being the responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed individuals that are on the team for RDM. But thinking about those consulted and informed folks can help make sure that there's political momentum, political capital to keep a program going. If we think about processes, going back to the concept of the RACI matrix, typically speaking, your governance staff, these are going to be your stewards, your data owners. They're the people that are going to interoperate with each other when it comes to governance. But if you look at the broader picture that we're talking about here, which is that reference data underpins master data, what you're also going to see is you're going to see these cross-domain processes pop up. So it's important to think not just consider not just the processes that happen within a domain, but think about those trans-domain processes where you have to cobble together or connect reference data sets to things such as your customer hierarchies, or connect things such as your cost centers or financial reference data to products, that kind of thing, or suppliers. So those processes taken in total, which can be both on-demand, I would say user-driven processes, like I'm going to go request a new cost center, those kinds of processes, as well as automated processes, both of those are going to be part of the RDM program. And then systems, and I think we'll talk a little bit about this a little bit later, but it's important to remember that, a lot of people think about reference data as a simple country code list, or they think about that. They say, oh, well, it's just the ISO code and the country name. That's it. That's reference data. But if you look at what we're saying is that within your value chain, all the overlay processes in your organization, that would be finance, or overlay processes being shared services, finance, IT, folks in HR, procurement, GRC, all of those particular groups that are supporting every part of your business, they're a huge generator of private reference data. And when you look at what finance is doing, or what folks in GRC are doing, or what folks in HR are doing, you're really talking about more than just code lists. You're talking about code lists, hierarchies, you're talking about complex hierarchies, in some cases both standard and alternate, multidimensional hierarchies. You're also talking about things such as intersections with reference data coming out of the different operating lines. So when you think about the system, you need to think about how am I going to support all of that? And then if you also agree with our idea that the reference data is going to have a strong intersection with things such as governance, then you got to take a little bit further. It's not just the code lists or maintaining that. Because if it was, if you do the contra, if it was just code lists, then in theory we could solve all this with Excel, right? Because Excel is really good at maintaining 2-column spreadsheets. So, and I think most people would agree that reference data management is a little bit more than just maintaining stuff in Excel. Finally, did you have any comments, Solomon?
No, I think that you covered that quite well. I like the way you broke out the people, process, and the systems, and the examples that you gave. I think that it's very helpful to people to get that larger view because, through no fault of their own, a lot of times when people envision people, processes, and systems, they tend to take a very myopic or narrow view. And one of the things that you underpinned, which I think is critically important, is understanding the business process and how that process not only crosses in particular vertical where one might be working, but it's those cross-vertical, it's those overlays, those HR, those GRC, those finance, understanding how this reference data is critical to those processes, I think is something that absolutely need to be called out for that.
Oh, and GRC for those, that's governance, risk, and compliance. So anyone that works in financial services or healthcare probably knows what GRC stands for, but some of the folks probably, not everyone works in those industries. Should we move on to talking about systems or?
Yeah, absolutely.
Super quick, Conrad and Solomon, just a quick time check, just FYI, we're at 11:36 Mountain Standard Time. Probably, I think we've still got quite a bit of content that we need to cover, but perhaps we can try and finish getting through the slides by, let's just say 11:50, so we have time for questions. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah, that sounds very reasonable. Solomon, are you okay with that? Or?
Sure.
So just, I guess maybe we can cover this quickly. If you've attended an MDM DG Summit in the past couple of years, you've probably seen this list pop up in Aaron Zorn's talk. He's the Chief Research Officer for the MDM Institute. He broke up broke out these 8 top requirements. I think they're pretty good. Certainly feel free to agree or disagree. But, you know, if I look at it, a lot of the requirements here really center on the idea that it's more than code lists, you know, and it's more than simple hierarchies. So when you think about that RDM solution, the ability to manage simple and complex forms, that's very important. And also this trans-domain or multi-domain kind of hierarchies, multi-domain relationships, that's really a big thing. The connect reference data sets across domain, we've talked a lot about that, but time is also kind of important. And the reason why time is important is if you think about accounting problems, a lot of organizations or some organizations will do things like manage their organization by period, which means that they're going to maintain information about how the cost structure or how the revenue structure changed over fiscal years. Understanding how the hierarchies intersect with each other is something that RDM can help with. The idea that you want to support multiple facets, that's just really this idea that there are different interpretations or there are different overloads that you can place on the reference data. And I think a very simple example is internationalization, or probably more appropriately, localization. If I have an English language classification set, the Japanese version is not a different version of reference data, it's just different labels on my English version. So there is a need to maintain that kind of inheritance or overload capability. A couple of things on here, you know, obviously governance I think is quite important. Is there anything else here that you want to highlight, Solomon? Can we move on?
Yeah, just one quick point, and you know, it's really related to number 2, and I think that that connect reference data as sets across domain and time, you did call out some very significant aspects of that. But one of the other things that I think is important is to bear in mind that for folks listening is that what you implement in your master data domain, and this really just underpins what Conrad just mentioned, what gets implemented in 2017 from a master data perspective may not be the same in 2019. And it's just another way of thinking about it, and bearing that your organization will change, there will be acquisitions, there will be divestitures, there will be reorgs, there will be a number of different impacts to that. Your RDM solution will help you look back to say, well, this is what the organization looked like at that time. This is what it looked like in 2017. This is what it looks like, what it could look like in 2019, so that you can look at those contrasting differences. And I think that is one of the most significant. And again, this isn't the reference data, this is the reference data management aspect that I think is really critical to understand. And I know that we don't have a lot of time here, I called out, but we do have sessions where if there's interest, we can actually demonstrate that through some other examples. But go ahead.
No, I think we can move on to the next slide since we're going to have to race for the exit. Did you want to finish this? I mean, I think,
sure.
You know, okay, go ahead.
Well,
sorry.
Absolutely. So, no, not at all. So to recap, just bear in mind that reference data is foundational. It is important. It needs to be able to connect those various constituencies, sources from which it comes, the various domains, and the various systems. It is semantically stable, and it provides context and classification. Really simply put and boiled down, if you have a plan or strategy or an ongoing master data management initiative, and you're not sure, unclear, or unaware of how the reference data is being managed, that's something you want to find out very, very quickly. It's that important because that master data, again, if you understand that the context and how that data is organized, you will find gaps if that reference data component is not well defined, articulated, or designed. And then the reference data management is that people, process, and systems use to keep reference data accurate and consistent. Really simply stated, it has to have ownership. There must be ownership, there must be stewardship of it in the same way that you have stewardship around master data. Reference data needs to be stewarded as well. And again, one of the points please take away from this is that if everybody owns it, nobody owns it. And that someone needs to own, particularly that public reference data or that semi-private reference data, where you'll see a lesser degree of everybody, but it's still very broadly spread. So there still needs to be that stewardship and ownership around it as well. And so when you're looking at your processes and systems, very similar thought is that it's not just the processes within the vertical from which you're pulling data for these systems. It is the processes that span the organization, because reference data spans the organization. And those various systems, not just internal, but also understanding how this information is going to be shared externally, and moreover, how this reference data is going to organize and classify that master data that's going to be shared internally and externally. So, because reference data is so foundational, poor quality reference data affects data quality everywhere. It is a ripple effect. Looking back across this presentation, as Conrad had alluded to, the very nature, the graph nature of reference data, if one point in that relationship matrix fails, it absolutely will ripple and cause consternation and challenges for all of the other data elements that are related to it. It absolutely will create issues in analytics, because again, as we are classifying and organizing and looking at that data, whether we're pulling that from the business glossaries, our data catalogs, our metadata, our technical metadata and transformations and calculations, those analytics will absolutely decrease in value as the quality decreases. And that quality can be traced back, particularly if you're leveraging that MDM solution as the golden record, as the best available record for those analytics, for those dimensions, for those data warehouses, as you're pushing that into the meta layers, or regardless of which BI tool you're using, it will cause significant downstream impact. And, a great place to begin your MDM journey, because the reference data will span multiple domains, it is a place where you can, again, get significant buy-in to support. You can drive through it, and then have the organization evangelize on your behalf because of the value that you're getting. So you're not the only voice singing about the criticality of it. And it absolutely is a critical path for every multi-domain MDM program. Because again, the true value of multi-domain is not saying that we have 5 domains or 12 domains or 15 domains, but what is the insight that is gained by the relationship between those domains? Customer and vendor, patient and physician, contract and business partner, materials master and order. The relationships between the domains is where you get the value from a multi-domain perspective. And so because that reference data spans those multiple domains, it is critical path. It absolutely is. So these are some of the case studies. Conrad, would you like to talk through these?
Yeah, well, these were some case studies, I think, that were delivered at the last MDM summit. So I think we can skip this and then just go straight to questions.
Good deal. Excellent.
Okay.
Let's open it up.
Well, yeah, so there's actually quite a few questions. Did you want to go ahead and just take them, Deborah, or did you?
Yeah, let me take you through them. Absolutely. Thanks, Conrad. So one of the first questions that we've had come in is, how do you define a data asset? What does that list exactly include?
That's an interesting question.
Well, I'll give my thoughts, and then, I think then Solomon, you can feel free to chime in or agree or disagree. It doesn't matter. So I look at it. I think of data asset in the same sense of I think about fixed assets, right, within your organization. So it's going to be things that are material to, in a sense, the creation of value in your organization. So what that would mean is that information about your products, that's vital for sales support and marketing. So that, in a sense, is a data asset, right? So that's product data. Information about your customers, you're going to need that for reporting, for market analysis, for designing your actual operational field forces. That is also a data asset. But then other information, policies and procedures. If you work in a regulated industry, if you do not actually have data governance policies in place, data governance policies would actually be a data asset. Then you're going to, I'm sure, at some point, have a nice chat with your state AGs when they come and hit you for violating PII or violating privacy rules or violating PHI, depending on what industry you're in. So in a sense, there's kind of the data assets that create value. There's data assets that prevent loss. But that's kind of what I think of. What I don't think data assets are individually, transactional records themselves are, I would say, probably not data assets. As a whole, if you're saying I want to do some kind of analysis on the clickstream, all of that could be seen as data asset, but an individual click, I'm not so sure. Solomon, what are your thoughts?
That's an interesting perspective, and I think that I do agree with 85 to 90% of your statement. I think we're in agreement there. The 15% where we have a slight divergence is that I do believe that the transaction itself, and let me preface it by saying this, that the definition of data asset is going to vary by context and use, right? I'm a data guy, and then so I also often go to context and use. And so I do believe that you're right, there are the value-driving, generating data assets. There are the control, protection, and securitizing data assets. And then I also think there are those analysis and research assets. So I think that the data itself all falls into the category of data asset. But depending on the context and usage of it is going to determine how you manage it. Because I do think that to a great degree, and then there's one other piece that I would also throw in there, and that's the unstructured data, the emails, the notes, the handwritten free-form text. Again, that unstructured data is a significant component of your data assets that most companies woefully under-leverage. And so it really depends on the context and use. I know there's a lot of other questions, but that's something that I think I could give a better response of writing because there's so much to it. But I think it boils down to context and use. Yeah,
I mean, to kind of clarify, I was really coming at it out of the idea that when you think about your organization, the organization as a whole, I think about the OODA loop, right? So you're going to observe, orient, decide, and then act. So it's like the data that's going to help you observe and orient or understand what's happening in your context. And that's going to be data you're going to feed into strategy, data you're going to feed into competitive analysis, all that's a data asset. Any data that you need to decide, so anything that's going to drive the decision matrix, and then data you need to act. So what do I need in my organization to execute on the strategy I develop? So that's how I tend to think about it. And then everything else kind of falls away. I mean, and I agree with you that, when I think about unstructured data, something that people ought to think about is, a lot of times unstructured data is important for making decisions or making observations. And maintaining the information in some cogent way is important, especially when you think about data assets.
Agreed.
Thank you both. Appreciate that. Thank you guys for the very thorough response. Next question. What are your thoughts around classifying images and the data related to images in particular?
I think that
yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. So image data has, again, two very broad contexts for me, and Conrad, I'd love to hear your viewpoint on this, is that there are those images that are related to the master data itself, such as product images, catalog images, media images, claims data where they're taking photographs and things along that line that are absolutely related to it. But moreover, into a larger category, it is that unstructured data. And I think it's absolutely critical to determine, again, context and usage. How is that image data going to be used? There are a lot of analytics that are being developed around the images. There are a lot of information that can be gained from a functional perspective of leveraging those images. But I do think that, again, depending on the context and usage, that those images, as they are part of the unstructured data, it depends on how we're going to use it and how we're going to organize it. That then determines how we need to manage it. And Conrad, I'll toss it to you.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it really depends on the context. And I think you're correct in saying that there's a big difference between image metadata. So it's a JPEG, it's a PNG, it's a product image, those kinds of things, versus the actual image information. So the bits and bytes of the actual image and what it represents. There's a corollary to this, and I think, and there's a couple questions actually about this as well, because there's some bits and pieces in here around processing documents. Something that I think doesn't really come up is that as people move into data science, I think what they are missing is they seem to be forgetting that the actual classification list that you're going to use to classify the images in and of itself is reference data. You know, so I know folks out there that are looking at, say, classifying restaurant reviews. So if I process a restaurant review and it's for a Szechuan restaurant, is that a Szechuan restaurant or is that a Chinese restaurant? And if I decide to take all the Chinese provinces and say, I've got a Szechuan restaurant, I've got a Hunan restaurant, I've got a Cantonese restaurant, and I break it up in that fashion, then does that actually help me, or does that hurt me in the sense that a lot of folks don't know what a Szechuan restaurant is? So part of what we've seen out there is an interplay between reference data that's used for classification in data science versus reference data that's used for classifying or scoring metadata versus reference data, or in some cases, maybe content data about what this image represents or whatever, you know, what it's for. So that's actually the thing, right? But there's another part to it too, which is when you're looking at a master data record, is having unstructured data visible when you're looking at that record helpful for the user to make a determination about the content? Or is it helpful for the governance folks to make a decision about whether or not this is classified properly? So that's the other part of it, which is, you know, bringing the data to users to allow them to get access to both the structured and unstructured data at the same time when they're doing governance. I think that's another facet of it. So I don't know if that answered the question, but any thoughts there, Solomon?
I do, and I think what you did was an excellent description without using two particular words that tend to confuse people. And I love the way you described it. Ontologies and taxonomies. And I know that frightens a lot of people when they hear those two words. And so I tend to use, you know, the forest and the trees example, as opposed to ontology and taxonomy. And I think that you just described the need as a significant step in that governance model to really align on what is the definition, what is the organization, what does, you know, if you look at the ontology as the forest and then the taxonomy as the tree, for this forest to completely understand the context of this data. And I think that's what we're doing. And, you know, of course, our separate ways are really reinforcing the point to folks that context and that context and purpose are going to determine how you manage it and how you use it. And so that's one of the things that I would just throw in there is that ontology and taxonomy or forest and trees organization will help, particularly on the governance side, organize and classify that data.
Excellent. Thank you both. Thank you. And Solomon, I've seen you do that whiteboard session, the forest and the trees, and every time I see it, I learn something new. So I love it when you give that example. We've got time to take one more question, 3 minutes, and then we're going to have to call it quits. And we will answer these via email. Jacqueline, thanks so much for this question. I really, this one kind of stood out for me. Would it be a good idea to consider personal data such as GDPR, which we are very familiar with, HIPAA and PCI, as semi-private reference data?
Well, you know, I'll take a crack at that. I think that the party or the individual that is represented by the personal data element, I think that is actually, that is master data, right? So my health data, that's master data. My address information, that's party data, so it's master data. Whether or not my diagnoses are private PHI or private health information or protected health information or not, that's actually governance data, but it's governance data that's being applied to my master data, or in some cases my patient record transactional data, and it's used as a reference, but for governance purposes. I mean, so, you know, you're talking about the forest and the trees. I mean, you know, you can see that the context of the actual data is going to change depending on the use case. Because if you're thinking about how do I score data coming out of a EHR or electronic health record, how do I score it based on HIPAA rules? The catalog of things you're going to use to score it, that's reference data, but the action you're taking is really more governance related. And I think the same thing is true for GDPR. Like, for example, I would say that, you know, the rules and regulations that GDPR has and the relationship that it has to the policies that you develop internally, that's very much governance data, but the actual GDPR rules are being used as reference data to build a hierarchy of all their policies. It's kind of giving you coverage, understanding where do we have policies, where do we not have policies. Within GDPR, and the same is true for HIPAA and all the other privacy rules, there's often terms of art that are there that define very specific things, such as what is protected information, right, or what a minor is, right, those kinds of things. And those are all forms of reference data. That's kind of my opinion. Salman, do you have any comment?
Yeah, I like the context that you leverage between the governance, the reference, and the master data. And I guess the only thing that, and I agree with it, flat out, I agree with it. And the only piece that I would add to that is as you are defining those attributes that fall into how are we articulating, how are we defining it, the reference data, how are we relating it, and how are we measuring it and organizing it, and then the actual master data is the what is being managed and or measured. Just put it in that simpler context, I absolutely agree with you, but it does bear in mind that it's not it's not a ruler that you can apply and say an inch is an inch or a centimeter is a centimeter. There is nuance to it, and it really comes down to understanding the industry, understanding the business and the context in which you're going to be using it. And so it is going to take some time. It is going to take some discussion and some modeling sessions, some workboard, some whiteboarding, and, you know, work sessions to get through it, to model it appropriately. And I just wanted, as going through these processes, if they're like, oh my God, we're still doing this, we're still talking about this. Yes, sometimes, because it's not a one size fits all, and it's not, you know, a pound is a pound, the world around type rule. It is going to vary. Just bear that in mind as you go through this process.
Well, but that's why you guys are around.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I didn't want to do that shameless plug, but thank you.
Thank you both so much, and thank you also to our attendees. We hope that this was helpful. It has been recorded and will be posted to the datasourceconsulting.com website. Like I mentioned, we'll be sending out the answers to the question via email. And Allison, who heads up our marketing here, I know we've got an upcoming webinar in December. Is that correct?
We actually had to move it to January. It's going to be Thursday, January 11th for SSAS for tabular cubes.
Great. Yep. January 11th, SSAS tabular cube.
Mhm.
Looking forward to that.
Mhm.
Okay, Solomon, Conrad, and all of our attendees, thank you so much and have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.